So I'm just going to briefly introduce David Casimir, who is here. He's a patent attorney, specializes in intellectual property law, especially in the biological and chemical technology area. Has a PhD in biochemistry, a law degree from Stanford, teaches in various areas at the University of Wisconsin, and is also a founding member of Porta Sophia, which is a psychedelic prior art library, which we'll hear about tonight. And really excited to have him here. And also the three of his teammates, Amanda, Shaheen, and Tom, are also here. They'll also be speaking with us. And I'll let them introduce themselves when they're sort of get the baton of the presentation. But I'm really happy and excited that they're here to talk on this really important and ever evolving topic of patents in the psychedelic space, and how they're working to keep things fair and honest, which I think will be very important as things evolve. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Casimir and stop talking.
All right, and let me share my screen here. Is everyone seeing a single slide at this point? All right. As mentioned, I'm Dave Casimir, and we're going to talk to you today about patenting in the psychedelic space. It's been a topic that's gained a lot of interest, I think, in particular in the last year, as we see corporations start forming around these types of technologies. And one of the questions a lot of people ask is why should anyone care in particular about patents as a topic? And I want to give an example, and this is a fictional example, but it's the type of example that is what we could actually see in real life. And I think in certain contexts, we are seeing it in real life. Just to give a feel for the big impact that patents can have on whether an idea or basic research actually finds its way into the clinic at some point, which I think we all would love to see. These compounds and related compounds maximize their clinical benefit in the future. And so, fictional scenario, but imagine that you have a family member with severe depression. Obviously, it's dramatically affecting their life, it's affecting your life, and you're a researcher, and you have some power to do something about it. You recall from your earlier college days, you had a friend who was in a similar situation and had told you that they'd cured themselves by candy flipping, basically taking a combination of LSD and MDMA. And you recall that, and you're thinking, well, we're getting to a spot where the federal government is sort of taking off the handcuffs on a number of these compounds, at least allowing research to happen now. Let me explore that. And so you explore that in your laboratory, and you find out it works, and it works quite well. In fact, you're quite convinced that this is going to change the quality of life for thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people around the world. So you decide to actually start a company to commercialize it. You initially reach out to friends and family. They invest money. You put a lot of your own personal money in it. You work at the company while keeping your faculty position or your university position at the same time. You're working 18 to 20-hour days for 3 years. You've got all of your money and all of your life in this. It's working great. You're at a point where you're ready to go to the FDA and start the regulatory process to get this approved for clinical use. You can see the end here, and you can see the hope that can be realized. But you realize these FDA trials are extremely expensive. You need tens of millions of dollars just to start the process. You'll eventually probably need hundreds of millions of dollars to get through the process. So you reach out to your friends and family, and none of them have that kind of money. So then you do what everyone has to do. You reach out to institutional investors. And when you talk to them, none of them are willing to give you money. And they're not willing to give you money because they all note the same problem. Someone was granted a patent on the idea of the use of two psychedelics together as a therapeutic. And you're thinking to yourself, well, how can that be? People have been doing that probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But they did. They got a patent on it. And you tell the investors, well, I don't think that's a good patent. And you talk to an attorney, and the attorney tells you, yes, that patent's not valid. but it's going to cost you a lot of money to knock it out, to prove that it's invalid. And you ask how much, and they tell you it's millions and millions of dollars to prove that. So you go to the investors and you say, well, we can get rid of this patent. Everyone knows it's bad. And the investors say, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you the money. If we're going to give you $10 million, we want you to do research and development. We want you to do clinical trials. We don't want you fighting in court with our money. And court cases are unpredictable. We're just not willing to invest. And no matter what you do, you can't get those funds to get through that initial regulatory trial. And you end up not being able to succeed with your product. Your company goes out of business, the product never hits the market. And no one else is willing to then advance the story either, because they've heard about your story and they don't want to be in the same situation. So we had this incredible opportunity that could have had a huge clinical impact go down because someone got a bad patent. And that's really kind of what we're going to be talking about, is what are good patents, what are bad patents, what are good patent practices, and what can we within the community do to maximize the chance that only good patents make it through the process, the bad ones don't, and the type of story I just told you never happens. And so with that in mind, I'll just give a quick introduction of the presentation and then turn it over to one of my co-workers here. So we're going to talk about the psychedelic renaissance, why this issue has become more important recently. We're going to give you an introduction to some of the legal issues around patents to give you a better feel for how these things work. We're going to talk about why patents, particularly in the psychedelic space, create some unique challenges, and they have created some unique challenges. We're seeing more bad patents come out of this field than most other fields. We're going to tell you about Porta Sophia, the organization we created to combat bad patents and to minimize the chances that they come out. And you're going to find out that bad patents don't come out because everyone's being a bad player. They can come out because people are bad players, but they can also come out for innocent reasons. And what we want to do is make sure only good patents come through the process, regardless of the motivation of why the bad patents were in the queue. And then we're going to talk about good patenting strategies and then give a close to home example of what this looks like. And so from there, let me turn it over to my colleague, Amanda Pratt, to take us to the next step.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Pratt, and I am the data archivist at Porta Sophia. So I work on the data and archival team, and I specifically am working on the Archival Researcher Network, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I'm also a PhD candidate in English at UW-Madison. And my dissertation research is on psychedelic rhetoric. So really the way that people talk about psychedelic, which is sort of fitting why I'm tasked with introducing this slide that has a lot of different headlines displaying really what some of this rhetoric around psychedelics looks like. So yeah, mainstream interest in psychedelics, this is probably not new to anyone in this room, is definitely growing, right? And so that can really be gauged by headlines. And so in this, on the right-hand side of the slide here, you see many different headlines that are kind of addiction focused. Those psychedelics are really framed as transformational much more widely to really reflect the wide variety of domains that research is taking place within. And so you can see that BBC headlines, so worldview changing, right? So there's the slippage from psychedelics being effective with addiction, right? To like sort of changing the world often. And so while these sources draw evidence from scientific studies, it's kind of well documented that compared to research articles, the strength of claims in more popular genres like the ones you're seeing here tend to increase, right? And this is especially true, I think, in psychedelics. And so as mainstream interest grows, there's kind of this concurrent increase in interest in profiting from them. And the image on the left here is from the front cover of The Nation recently, an article by Zoe Cormier called "The Brave New World of Legalized Psychedelics is Already Here, and So Are the Profiteers. Get Ready for Psychedelics, Inc." You can go to the next slide, Dave. So just some metrics, again, really underscoring that this scientific push and this kind of psychedelic renaissance, as you know, the overview said, and then I'm sure you've already heard a lot, is really driven by the scientific aspect, right? So there's lots and lots of clinical trial registrations. As you well know, those are rising yearly. The market value is just sort of ballooning, and there's some controversies around what that is based on and whether or not that will crash, right? But more than 50 publicly traded and 35 private companies specializing in psychedelic medicine. And this is really funded through government at the state and federal level across the world. And here domestically in the US, we're seeing a lot of pushes towards decriminalization at the state level, also in some cities. And this is really getting support from high-ranking public figures, bipartisan heads of the NIH and FDA, and also Congress people. So yeah, that's my piece. And I think I'm going to pass to Tom.
Hello, my name is Tom Eisenbarger. I am also a patent attorney with a PhD in biomolecular chemistry. So I have science and law background. And I'll just give you a very brief introduction to patents to set up the problem that we're trying to fix. So a patent is a government created right. It's a form of intellectual property. So it's a right that the government gives to the person who obtains the patent to exclude others from making, using, selling, or offering for sale whatever is defined by the claims of that patent. So the claims of a patent are a legal description of something, let's say a psychedelic drug or a process for treating a person that has been granted. The person who has these claims has been granted this right to exclude others from doing what comes within the claim. So among the requirements for obtaining this right from the government is showing that what you're claiming is novel, so that's something that's new, and it has to be non-obvious, which means something that is sufficiently removed from something that's new. So small incremental changes or obvious increments in technology are deemed not to be worthy of patent. So there's you need to make a sufficient technological leap to obtain your patent. So how does one obtain a patent? There's a process for this, and in general, the applications are reviewed or examined by people called patent examiners. Examiners make sure the formal requirements of the patent application are taken care of, and they review the language of the claims to make sure that what the applicant is trying to patent meets these criteria of being both novel and non-obvious. How is this done? So the process considers evidence of what is known by looking at what is called prior art. And so prior art is the term used in the patent world to describe this evidence of what's in the public, technologies that are in the public domain. And so examples of these types of things are listed here. Typically it's printed matter, so previous patents, journal articles, but also things such as books, presentations, public presentations, archival materials, anything that is publicly accessible. And then that's something that can be argued about, but that's generally how prior art is thought about. It's something that is accessible to the public and provides evidence that some technology is being used by the public. And shown on the right here is a very old piece of prior art from Prentice and Morgan that was published in 1896 related to mezcal. So what's the problem that we're trying to address? And that is dealing with prior art in the field of psychedelics. So psychedelics, as Dave alluded to, and Amanda, have a unique, or maybe not unique, but have a special history for many reasons. So one of them is that psychedelic compounds have been used for, thousands of years by people all over the world in several different forms. Coming into the early 1900s, people began to become interested in various chemicals and how they worked in the human body. and studies in the 1930s and 1950s of these compounds were starting to emerge, and people were doing, for that time, rigorous scientific studies in humans to understand these compounds and starting to understand some of the positive clinical benefits that could be obtained from use of these compounds. But then with changes in culture and social norms, into the 70s and 80s and coming into the war on drugs, the research was shut down, and there was still ongoing research in the form of underground experimentation and other forms that were not above board, but these compounds did not go away. And to this day, many of these compounds are continued to be listed as Schedule I drugs, which are those that have no recognized medical use. So because of the very old uses of some of these drugs and what happened in the 1970s and 1980s with research being largely discontinued, and stories and descriptions of these drugs and what they do to people being in sort of underground, a lot of the prior art is hard to find. So the documentation of the use and the effects of these substances is not as easy to find as it would be for many other fields. So if during the examination process, if a patent examiner cannot find evidence of something being in the public domain that has been used before, there is a chance that something that is in public use could be patented. There is a chance that something that is overly broad, so something where the rights that are granted to the applicant are not to something they have, not strictly for what they have invented or developed, but it could be some bleed over where the claim contains things that are in the public domain and people are already enjoying a benefit of using. And this could have chilling effects on research and development of good uses for these compounds, and most likely will cause increases in prices of drugs due to patenting. And then this one statistic here from this IMAC reported in 2017 was over the 5 years from 2012 to 2017, there was an average increase of about 70% in on-patent drugs. So we saw this as an issue of making the appropriate prior right available not only to patent examiners, but to researchers to know what is in the public domain, what is safe, presumably safe from being patented, and to anyone who's interested in what is known and where the innovation might be able to happen over and above what is known. Next slide.
All right. So
yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, thanks, Tom. So I think it's back to me now. And so Porta Sophia is a psychedelic prior art library, as we've said. And we really intervene at the prior art search stage of the patent prosecution process. I know it's a lot of P's, but, and I know there's a lot going on this slide, but I'll kind of walk through it somewhat slowly, and I'll give you a sense of kind of what our workflow looks like with the data and archival team. We also collaborate with the legal team, Dave and Tom, on this stuff too. And we really have two prongs. And the first of those prongs for our workflow is to build a psychedelic prior art library, right? So how do we do that? The first step is that we track psychedelic patents and applications. So we use two main search engines on the USPTO for domestic applications and patents, and the WIPO for international. And we have curated lots of different algorithms and search terms to generate the results that we're looking for on 31 different compounds currently. If folks know of other compounds that we should be looking out for that are not listed here, please let us know. But so literally every week we go into those two databases and put in our search terms, all different variations of them. You can imagine how spellings and dashes and things make a difference in pulling up relevant patents, right? And then we have those patents, and we then, the next step is evaluating them, right? So we have them all in kind of a database, and from there we really break down the claims, right? A patent, essentially, the vast majority of a patent, the bulk of it, is really a list of claims to innovation. And so we kind of analyze those claims, right? And I'll let Shaheen talk about our patent evaluation system in a little while when she talks about third-party submissions. But essentially, we're kind of evaluating the threat to the psychedelic landscape, right? So what is the likelihood that this patent application's claims could close off access to further innovation in the field, or downstream access to these therapies for the people that need them the most, right? Again, going back to Tom's point about patents really jacking up the price of various therapies and drugs. And so we evaluate them into 3 different tiers, tier 1 being the most egregious, if you will. And those patents are also kind of tagged with different bins, right? So a patent can be referring to the delivery of a particular drug, the formulation of a drug, a particular derivative, as Dave's first example talked about drug combinations, right? Combinations of serotonergic drugs, for instance. People patent the method of manufacturing a particular drug, or an actual method of treatment. We've seen that a lot in some more high profile cases. So in addition to those basic bins that we put the patents into, we also kind of curate them with kind of themes and keywords that are necessary for us to create these targets for finding prior art, right? So basically what the next step is finding and curating prior art, right? So essentially doing research to find the evidence that those claims to innovation are not in fact innovative. And we have like kind of a few different steps. The first one is a little bit more surface level, web-based search, right, of patent databases, journal articles, et cetera. And then we, on the second level, again, like I said, I'm kind of running this archival researcher network, which I'll talk again about in a second. And so that's looking at more difficult to find prior art that's not necessarily accessible in the databases you would think, but maybe in some archives and that kind of thing. And then after we have that prior art kind of identified, then we curate that prior art. So tag the prior art with targets, themes that directly, again, correspond to those patents that we were kind of identifying the targets for searching for prior art for. And essentially, if you want to go back. And then we bring it into the Porta Sophia prior art library, right? We pass it over to our web team, and all of those sources end up in the prior art library. And we're also working on compound timelines, which we won't get too much into today, but maybe we can talk about in the Q&A if folks are interested. I think our first one is a timeline about the use of psychedelics related to substance use disorders and addiction. That should be coming up in the next few weeks. And then Shaheen will talk about the second prong, which is third-party submissions. You'll see that sort of couched under the evaluate patents and derived themes area of this slide. And just a note that when we are evaluating those patents, the tier 1 patents are the most egregious. We're always kind of looking at which ones of those are ideal candidates for third-party submissions. And that's more of a direct intervention with the USPTO, which Shaheen will speak about in a little while. So yeah, go to the next slide. And this is actually a screenshot of our old theme on our website. We have a new one if you go to portasophia.org. And but this is our prior art library search tool. So a couple of just unique contributions that we have: when you find some prior art using our search tool, you will get kind of this expert curation that we have literally as humans generated, right? So I think this is especially valuable with some of the archival prior art and things that you wouldn't necessarily find just doing searches, right? So in a lot of cases, there may be copyright issues or something like that, where we can't necessarily reproduce, say, patient records that we find in an archive, but our data team does curate those references. So a patent examiner or whoever is using our website would be able to kind of pull out the most relevant material that would be, essentially serve as the prior art there. Also, keywords and quotes will be there to make things easier to find. And then the second piece here is that, again, everything in our library is really driven from what we're seeing in patent applications. So that's what the sort of patent enriched with patent derived themes means, right? Like everything that you see here is for the vast majority of the cases really in response to applications that we are seeing out there in the wild. And just another note about the kind of target audience for our website. We are, really targeting patent examiners, but also innovators, right? Who want to know what is out there, what has been done on this topic, and investors who want to know, am I investing in a company that's with, if they have all these patent applications that they're advertising in their press releases, are these actually legitimate? Can they actually be patented, right? And then also just sort of psychedelic researchers of all kinds. So we'll go to the next slide. And so here's my little pitch for the Archival Researcher Network. I do archival research in the psychedelic space, and instead of me going all over the world to do archival research, our Archival Researcher Network really seeks to tap into those people that are already doing it. And so the goal being to really make our library more inclusive of key archival sources in the history of psychedelics. And there's archives all over the world that kind of hold this knowledge of what has been done historically in this field. And so, yeah, it's kind of a big crowdsourcing effort for those patent-derived targets. And if you go to our website under, it's portasophia.org, and if you go to, I'll put the link in the chat in a couple of minutes, but there's I think it's under community submissions, there's an Archival Researcher Network tab there, and you can see our info sessions that we ran a couple of months ago to talk about all the different kind of, least you need to know about all the different aspects of what we're doing to understand the Archival Research Network and to get involved. And then the other kind of piece of that's really kind of cool of the Archival Researcher Network is that we're also kind of a public education goal here too. So we're creating opportunities for folks who, if they are remotely interested in archival research and the history of psychedelics, right? We're kind of offering professionalization for graduate students and other folks to get involved in this work for this very clear, active way to kind of wield historical knowledge to make a difference in the world, right? Which I think is something in the humanities that we're always kind of hip hip hooray over. So we have a virtual kickoff event that's free and open to the public that's coming up on June 2nd and 3rd. We have a great suite of speakers. We have Preeti Krishtel from IMAC, which is the link that I just popped in the chat and that Tom just referenced. She is our keynote speaker talking about kind of what her work with patents and access to medicines movement, what we can kind of glean from that research in the world of psychedelic patents. And then we also have a roundtable with a suite of speakers that will be kind of talking through this question of whether or not Indigenous knowledge should count as prior art. Is that desirable? And if so, how do we do that legally, right? And then we also have a workshop, again, aimed at kind of folks that are just kind of interested in getting into archival research and learning about it from the ground up. And so Stephanie Schmitz from the Purdue Betsy Gordon Psychoactive Substances Research Collection, she is the archivist there. She's kind of running a workshop on June 1st, actually, that will kind of give an overview of what psychedelic archival research looks like in the context of that collection. There's some really cool digital holdings, so that'll be a great opportunity for folks as well. And so I think we're going to Shaheen now, and she's going to talk about the role of third parties in patenting.
Thank you so much, Amanda. My name is Shaheen Shams, and I am a data curator over here at Porta Sophia. And I'm going to be talking to you today about how third parties can actually get involved in the patenting process. And this is actually relatively new, only with the passing of the America Invents Act back in 2011. And both of the options listed here, petition for post-grant review, as well as third-party pre-issuance submission, are available for any private citizen or for an entity to get involved in the execution of a specific patent. Next slide, please. So first, petition for post-grant review is a trial proceeding that occurs after a patent has been granted, where the patentability of one or more claims of that patent is being reviewed. So essentially, it's a third party telling the patent office that this particular patent needs a second look. They also provide evidence in the form of prior art and then a summary of their arguments as to why that particular claim should not have been granted. It's filed by someone who is not the owner of that patent and must occur within 9 months of that patent being granted. And though it's a rarely used option, there is one that is currently occurring in the field of psychedelic medicine against Compass Pathways by Freedom to Operate, Inc. It is still something that is developing. I think it was filed back in December of last year, so it's still unfolding and we're very anxious to see how it turns out. Next slide, please. But since petition for post-grant review is trying to undo something that has already been done, that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and because of that, it also has a significant cost. However, if you want to intervene a little bit earlier, also save some money, there is the option of pursuing a third-party pre-issuance submission that challenges the claims of patentability of a published patent application. So prior art is submitted for consideration by patent examiners overseeing that application-specific examination, but there is a far broader impact in this, is that prior art is likewise disclosed for consideration for all other pertinent patent applications filed by that party. And because of that, next slide, please. This is something, a tool that Porta Sophia does leverage within our mission. So after we have ranked our patents and patent applications, we take a look at the applications that have been ranked as tier 1 as very threatening, and then do a second round of evaluation on them to see if it warrants the pursuit of a third-party pre-issuance submission. First, we take another look at the claims. So are they overly broad? Are they attempting to sequester information from the public domain? Typically, if they are ranked tier 1, they already have met that standard. We then take a look at the applicant. So is this a repeat offender? Does this applicant have a history of seed applications? So that means that if they get a patent that is granted, will they then try to find a lot of other applications or file a lot of other applications that try to take up more real estate in that space? Is the applicant an entity with a very large footprint in this space? And is that entity's focused specifically on psychedelics or on other medicines as well? Then we take a look at the data as to whether that application actually contains any that support the scope of their claims and the overall threat that if that application was granted as is, would it restrict research and access to that therapeutic or application overall? We also have to take into consideration a time limitation, as in is this within the window that is allowed by the USPTO for a third-party submission, that is within 6 months of the application being published, or if there has been an office action filed that has questioned the merits of those claims at this point. Next slide, please. So one of the applications that have checked all those boxes is this one that is filed by Camtech, Inc. So titled is Compositions and Methods Comprising a Combination of Serotonergic Drugs. It's a part of a series of psychedelics-focused patent applications filed by this psychedelic-focused company and has very broad claims that are encompassing very well-established information. So as you can see, there are several of the claims listed on the screen at the bottom left. The first of which being a composition comprising a combination of a first serotonergic drug and a second serotonergic drug. So because of how broad that language is, it encompasses not only psychedelics, but hallucinogens, SSRIs, SNRIs, and a variety of other drugs within that space. Even when they try to whittle it down to the 2 drugs that are very much of interest to them, which are LSD and MDMA, as Dave was previously talking about, it's a very common recreational combination, known colloquially as candy flipping, and it's been used in underground psychotherapeutic research for decades. And not only that, but they also did not present any data to support these claims, and if granted, therefore, this application would have a significant impact in the field of psychedelic research and therapeutic spaces. Next slide, please. So as a result, we decided to file a third-party pre-issuance submission. And the anatomy of such in its most stripped down form is a first page that is a list of references that we are going to be citing in the body of the document, which is a claims chart. So essentially, we take all the claims that are within that application, isolate them, and then use quotations, screenshots, just direct evidence that are from those first list of references to directly refute the novelty and non-obviousness claims within the application of interest. Next slide, please. So in terms of impact of these third-party pre-issuance submissions, it puts invaluable information in front of examiners. It motivates the applicant to regroup and restructure their overly broad claims around the information submitted to even keep the application alive. And it really forces the hand of applicants to be accountable to stay within the bounds of the innovation that they've presented. So when we submitted that third-party pre-issuance submission against that Camtech application, within a month, Camtech canceled all 18 of its original claims that we filed against and submitted 7 new claims that are far narrower in scope. And though we cannot say for sure that it was as a result of our third-party pre-issuance submission, the time frame really does speak for itself. Thank you. Next slide. And I'm going to pass it back over to Tom.
Or actually, I think it's coming back to me.
Oh, Dave, there we go. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, and so kind of in wrap-up mode here. So this really gets to the issue of kind of good patents versus bad patents. And one thing I want to highlight is when we say bad patents, that always seems to imply that there's a bad player somewhere in the process. And when we do our research and figure out where these bad patents are coming from, most oftentimes it's kind of an innocent process. It's basically caused by an information gap where the patent office is lacking information. And so let me kind of describe a thing that a lot of people don't realize in patent law. Typically, an inventor will approach a patent attorney and describe their invention, and then the patent attorney will write up a document describing that technology and then putting in place these claims. And it's a very, very common custom to write the claims as broadly as possible, and oftentimes too broad. And the thought there is, well, we'll let the patent office do their review, we'll see what they have to say, and then we'll retreat to a fair space once they've identified all of the relevant prior art, and then we end up with a patent that's sort of just and fair. So that's a really common process. The problem in the psychedelic space here is, what if the patent office doesn't have the tools to do that job? So you file this really broad claim, which is kind of a custom. The patent office doesn't find anything, and they say, you can have that. Now there's sort of this interesting potential ethical dilemma. Do you retreat from that space, or do you take that patent? And depending on your own knowledge of the prior art, you might not realize that those claims are too broad. So if neither the patent applicant or the patent examiner is aware of this prior art, then that patent comes out, and it creates the type of problem we've been talking about here, where it could increase cost of products, could inhibit research, could inhibit commercial development, investment in the technologies. So what we really want to do here is we've created this tool to make the odds of that happening much less. And then part of our education outreach, like this process, is to arm as many people who are interested in this topic with the recognition that this problem exists, so that they can all play a role in minimizing the chance that bad patents come out the door. Because a lot of inventors don't want to own bad patents. Owning bad patents isn't productive for anyone, except perhaps companies who want to abuse the system. For innovators, especially at universities, getting bad patents is costly for them. You're spending money that you don't need to spend at some point. If it's important, someone's going to fight it, and you have to spend a lot of money to defend it, and maybe you don't want to defend it. It's just a mess. So cleaning this up at the earliest possible stage is a huge benefit. And so part of this means for all those who become aware of this issue, we'd love everyone at every part of the sort of information chain to be aware of these issues and do as much as they can to get good information in the hands of everyone in the process. So like university investigators, for them to learn about this themselves, they interact with typically an intermediate, a technology transfer office at their university, who might oftentimes, after the process starts, interact a lot with the attorneys, and the inventors maybe have less interaction. So there's another player in the pathway here who can influence the decision-making or be a lack of information in the decision-making, get the attorneys involved in knowing what this background is, and then ultimately the patent office. So the more people who are smart about these topics and informed about them, the less likely we're going to get damaging bad patents out in the world. And so, just a few tips that kind of relate to that, and kind of generally, if you're an innovator, have good communications with everyone in the process, with the technology transfer offices, with the attorneys. Just as a point to make sure, if you do innovate something important, it has to be novel and non-obvious, as Tom mentioned, and that includes novel and non-obvious in view of your own disclosures. So it's important to file your patent applications before you publicly disclose your own information. There is a 1-year grace period in the United States for that, but most countries don't give you that grace period. So for those things that are going to turn into good patents, it's important to file the patent applications before there are public disclosures. But I think the most important thing here is to have discussions with everyone in the chain about what is the right claim scope. And if you do start with really broad claim scope and the patent office says, we'll let you have that, and you shouldn't have it, to make sure someone in the communication chain is looking at that and fixing that problem before that patent gets granted. Especially researchers who will always know the field better than pretty much anyone else. and use tools like Porta Sophia to help you gain knowledge. And just a close to home live example here. We've got a Yale patent application with a very broad first claim. There's, I think, unquestionably, this is a leading research group, and I know we have some of the inventors on the call here with real innovations in here, but it's a classic patent application where the patent attorneys wrote a very broad first claim. So this, the first claim here is a method for treating headache disorders. The method comprising administering an effective amount of a composition comprising a psychedelic to an individual in need thereof and treating the headache disorder. Now, in a broad sense, that goes back to the 1800s at least, even ignoring sort of indigenous work that might go back thousands of years. Parke-Davis, the drug company that was eventually acquired by Pfizer, was actually investigating this in the late 1800s and had mescaline in their catalog in the early 1900s. And then the scientific literature had picked up on that again in the 1960s. So there's a clear track record of mescaline being used for headache treatments in a general sense. Cluster headaches, nope. Specific dosing, no. Was it sophisticated research? Not really. But this first claim is broad enough to cover that. So, right. So if this first claim, if the patent office says you can have it, essentially this patent would block things that were happening even back in the 1800s, right? So this claim needs to be narrower. What's the fair scope? To be determined by patent attorneys and inventors talking with each other. But this is an example of a typical patent application with a broad claim that normally the patent office would say no to, and then there'd be a negotiation and a fair patent would come out of the process. But in the psychedelic space, the odds that they'll say you can have that go up a good bit. And so just wanted to highlight sort of one really close to home example. And with that, that concludes the presentation. So let's see, just a thank you from our team. And we're happy to stick around and do a Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. So, yeah, like the last example, I saw Dr. Schindler in here somewhere, so, and I saw her name on the patent, so that was great to bring that in. We'll open it up for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand with the virtual Zoom function, and I can call on you and unmute you, and you can ask your question. You can also type it into the chat. So we'll just open the floor. I'm going to look through the chat and see if.
And there was one that came in on chat. You want me to handle the chat question?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so one question was, can you comment on the behavior of compass pathways in the patent space? So this, it's always hard to know exactly what's going on in someone's brain, but the compass pathway patents have gotten a lot of attention. So there's sort of two areas that have been controversial with compass pathway and their patents. So they have some issued patents that are relatively narrow in scope, in that they're directed to a specific composition of psilocybin based on a particular crystalline polymorph. And so it's not, they don't cover sort of all use of psilocybin for, their focus is treating depression. But it turns out, based on a peer-reviewed publication that came out this last November, that polymorph may not be real. Based on the analytical data in that study that came out, the polymorph appears to just be a mixture of two well-known compounds and not a real polymorph. And that study also demonstrated that that combination, that mixture, what has been present in samples that were used historically. For example, they're present in the materials that Johns Hopkins has been using that predates the compass pathways work in their clinical trial that's ongoing for depression, but even materials that went back to the 60s and 70s. The group who did the paper got their hands on that material, had it tested, and showed that the same spectral properties were present there. So those patents are the ones that are being challenged in the post-grant review process that was mentioned earlier on that basis. But compass pathways also has been controversial because of some pending patent applications they have that have extraordinarily broad claims, basically using psilocybin to treat depression generally, which they did not invent. That certainly came before them. And those patent applications got a lot of, I think, bad press because they went into, they claim things like set and setting, the idea of treating someone for depression with psilocybin with certain body contact or certain lighting or certain comfortable furniture or music in the room, all of which were sort of known things. And so that's where Porta Sophia actually intervened. Because that was a pending application, we actually did a third-party submission against that patent application, point by point, showing that every one of the features in those claims was in the prior art. So I would say Compass has been really aggressive with their patenting. We know they're sophisticated enough to know some of those broad claims are not patentable, but they pursued them anyway. And so, we felt that our role was to arm the patent office with the knowledge they needed to say no to that going forward.
And I have a quick question. Are there other people in this space sort of helping to watch out for these bad patents that might be coming through, or are you all sort of the main or only group doing this?
No, there are actually quite a few groups. So the FTO organization, who has challenged the Compass pathways in the post-grant review process, has been a watchdog for this. There are some other groups as well that have been tracking patent applications in this space. And then we've all been connecting with each other. So we've actually got this, decent network of people that are all, benefiting from each other's skills and bandwidth to make sure that we're collectively working to minimize the harm here.
All right, see, Colleen.
Hi, yes, this is great work. Yes, my noodles are good. So I wanted to know, I know you said that there was going to be kind of a debate about the indigenous knowledge and whether or not that should and could be patented. I'm wondering if there are like any other examples in maybe other areas where like verbal or oral traditions have been authorized or kind of approved or considered prior art, and if not, like in order for that to be approved, would it have to be written down?
Yeah, great question. So there are not a lot of examples. And the reason for that is when the patent office or others are looking for prior art, you tend to look for the things that are the easiest to use as prior art. And in almost every technical field, there is sort of traditional peer-reviewed literature that you can find in databases, or sometimes harder to find things, but well-accepted bits of evidence, like someone's PhD thesis defense that's logged in a library. It's hard to find, but it's sort of a traditional type of piece of prior art that people are used to accepting. So the indigenous knowledge hasn't been tested a lot. At the end of the day, oral is sufficient, but what you need to do is present sufficient evidence to show that that information, in whatever form it was in, was and is publicly accessible to those in the field who would want to find it. And an original incident of, say, an indigenous use of a compound, there may not be an actual record of that anymore, especially if it's predating videos and audio recordings and things like that. But if someone documented that information, the date of the fact that it was documented can count as prior art. So let's say in 1960, someone wrote down and say published a book on indigenous knowledge from 80 years earlier or 200 years earlier. And that book describes certain uses of psychedelics for certain indications. That book would count as the prior art based on its date, even though what it's describing is something that happened way earlier. And that's perfectly sufficient. So there needs to be some evidence you can point to that is of a nature that the legal system accepts. And that's always the challenge. And I think there's work to be done here on getting the legal system to accept new types of information that maybe they haven't seen a lot before. And this field in particular is probably going to put pressure on that and be an area where some new law is created. All right, a couple other hands up here. Dr. Schindler, let's have your question. I don't know whose hand went up first.
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh.
I did the same thing.
Thanks. I feel like I should make an appearance since
Yeah, and apologies for putting you on the spot there.
No, but this is a very helpful talk, and I was really looking forward to it. That as researchers, we're focused on our work and our research, and this patent is filed by a different person, and I'm legally required to be named as an inventor. So it's not my patent. I'm legally, this is what I was told. I'm legally required to be listed as inventor, even if it's not my patent. I do recall many meetings back and forth with the attorneys and such, and I remember thinking these are a lot of claims at the bottom. And I said, no, that's normal. That's normal. There's usually a lot of claims. So this is really informative because this is outside of my field. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not. This was my first experience with a patent. So I do have regular meetings with the patent office. So I'll certainly want to talk with them further.
Yeah, and just, we felt comfortable putting that up there because we've heard about your reputation as a really honorable researcher and scientist. So I wasn't too concerned about raising that. You have a wonderful reputation in the field.
Thank you.
So Amadeus.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm a first-year PhD student in medical anthropology at Princeton, and I'm really interested in what counts as legitimate knowledge when you're looking for prior art. Like, for example, could something as informal as like an Erowid experience vault report, would that count? I mean, what is considered legit?
Yeah, it gets tricky on the margins, but as an initial point, anything that's publicly accessible, and in one case, even not publicly accessible, I'll describe that in a second, counts as prior art. The impact of it then depends on how high the quality of the information is, how reliable it is. So the fact that it has a legitimate date on it that predates the filing of the patent application brings it in. If it needs to be accessible to someone in the field, so the Erowid database certainly would be, so that qualifies. But then when we say, I would call those sort of individual case reports on there, right? There's a lot of personal experiences that are listed on there. How good is the data? How good is that as evidence? It's not as good as a peer-reviewed literature from that standpoint. There can be questions about whether that person accurately remembered their experience, and people can make challenges on those grounds. But what I would say is, in a lot of these patent applications we're seeing with lots of really broad claims, there'll be more than one Erowid experience. There might be 5, and then similar information from other places. So even if you sort of cast doubt on one of them, the collection of them starts to reveal a story that is hard to refute.
And I will say too that I think in some cases, even if something like an Erowid forum discussion or post isn't, scientifically rigorous or statistically, characterized, it does provide evidence that at least people were thinking about perhaps a certain combination, or would provide evidence that there was a motivation to do certain things in the past that can be helpful to show that something is obvious. So people were talking about this, so the idea was out there. That can be very helpful as something that shows that a claim is obvious.
Yeah, and I'll note too that some of the worst offender patent applications we've seen have no data. So there was one, it actually issued, unfortunately, just to show an example of something that issued, was the use of LSD to treat food allergies. It was filed by a hedge fund group from the Bay Area. There was no data in it. They just had the idea and they wrote it down on paper, and they submitted it to the patent office, and they got the patent granted. It's not new. People have been treated for food allergies with LSD forever, and there's records of that in old books. But it got granted, right? But now in a situation like that, something like an Erowid post, I think, is strong enough, right? Because if the patent owner said, well, there's no data on that, how credible is that? The patent office will turn around and say, well, there's no data in your patent application either. How credible is your result, right? That's as good as what you did. So depending on how strong the patent application is itself, even something that's sort of not built on a statistical model may be just as good as what someone disclosed in their patent application.
Cool, thanks.
All right, Jordan.
Thank you all for presenting and all the work you're doing. It's really awesome work. So I have two questions. One is, I'm curious to hear about, it's obvious like some of the grandfather psychedelic molecules are going to be harder to patent, mescaline and psilocybin. What do you see happening with like Me Too versions of psychedelics that, they're going to just tweak, add a methyl group, take psilocybin and just deuterize it, or whatever, just some modification that maybe changes instead of 6 hours, it's 4 hours, and which might actually have some clinical relevance. But I'm imagining we're going to see just so many of these kind of Me Too psychedelics coming out, and I'm wondering how that is going to play out. And
let me handle that first, if you don't mind, and then we'll handle the second one. My brain's not good enough to sort of answer that and then remember your second question at the same time. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple of points on that. That is a strategy pharmaceutical companies have used for a long time. It's getting harder to do. So the patent office has been sort of pickier about that. Where you can still be successful with that is if you do show some real benefit to the new compound, even if it's a minor change. That can get you somewhere. Like, if you can turn a 6-hour psychedelic experience into a 30-minute one, that's going to be pretty remarkable. Even if the chemical change on the molecule is fairly small, you're probably going to have some success with a patent claim around that. But if it's a trivial thing, or there's no real difference, but you're just claiming this new composition of matter because you made this minor change, it's getting harder. You can still get patents on that. I will note that US Congress is considering some legal changes to make it much harder to do that because of the controversies around big pharma extending their monopolies beyond the normal 20-year patent life by playing games with that strategy. So we may see some changes that'll make it even harder to get, but the trend has been, it's been more challenging to get those claims than it has been historically. One other thing I'll say is they will oftentimes have less impact in the real world as well. If the original compound works and is safe and works essentially the same, their patent will only cover their modified version, and the original one will still be available for people to use clinically. Sorry about that. Second question.
Yeah, I guess it was. I have too many. One was just I was curious to hear a bit about the fund, like who's funded Porta Sophia and how you've, because all this supporting all this archival great work that you're doing. And the other is just if you could say something about the difference of like use patents, like Emmanuel's, that versus, or even like what Compass was, it was a little unclear if they, they had the polymorph thing, which seemed very narrow and like not that concerning, but then there was this piece of like their use, are they trying to patent its use in depression, and would that block other molecules or something? So
yeah, sure. So Porta Sophia is a nonprofit. It's a public interest organization. We are funded by donations, and our biggest donors are listed on our website if you want to see who they are to date. We operate on a lot of volunteer work. We do have paid employees. There's a lot of, as you can imagine, IT work and, just massive amounts of data analysis, and these things cost money. But like Tom and I have volunteered our time. I think all of the legal work to date from anyone who's participated has all been volunteer. The archival network, Amanda can correct me if I'm wrong, is all volunteer work. So it's been a lot of volunteer work and then relying on donors. And thankfully, there's been donors willing to support this. And if anyone here wants to be a donor, head to the website, and there's places where we'd love your assistance, because the next several years are going to be the important ones to sort of stop these early broad patents. And then I think the system will start taking care of itself after that. So the next few years are critical. So that was the funding. And then the second question was Compass method claims and method claims in general. Yeah, so a lot of people don't realize, when you think about patents, you think about patents covering things, a new drug, a new screwdriver, a new wrench. But one of the things the patent system allows you to protect is processes or methods. And any kind of processes or methods. Parker Brothers, the makers of the board game Monopoly, actually had a patent on playing the game Monopoly, where it was a process for moving pieces around a board and collecting rents. There was a famous bad patent. A 7-year-old child from Minnesota filed a patent on a method for swinging on a swing where you pull on the chains so that you move side to side rather than backwards and forwards. And the US Patent Office actually granted that because they couldn't find prior art. Now, I was born long before this kid and I did that, so I was my own prior art on that, but the Patent Office ended up retracting it after great embarrassment when that caught some public attention. But that's like a method for swinging on a swing. So you can also get methods for treating people for diseases by giving them a particular compound. Now, what's interesting about that is the actual person doing the method is oftentimes the patient or their doctor. But the law says that anyone who induces someone to do the method is also on the hook for violating the patent. So typically what you see when someone has a patent like that is they don't sue doctors or patients. They sue the drug companies who are selling into that field a drug for that purpose. And that's where those fights tend to happen.
I have a question. Could you say a little bit more about that, the patent that was submitted and then granted for the LSD for allergies, and just like the overall approach of submitting patents without any data, just wild claims? Because it seems like you could just sort of shotgun everything and then just without any data, it seems like that would be easy enough to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So a lot of people don't realize this either, but the US Patent Office and most patent offices around the world don't require you to have actually made the invention work. It's called a prophetic invention. It's just a prophecy. And it's so long as what you described can work or does work, or you can later demonstrate that it does work, you still are allowed to get that patent, even if it's purely an idea. So that's always been a controversial area of patent law, but it is, a formal part of US law and the law of most other countries. And so people have certainly abused that. I think we're seeing some of that in the psychedelic space. Whenever there's a land grab, you see people do that, right? There's this open space, people have brainstorming ideas, and then they flood the patent office with patent applications and see what they can get. And maybe most of them get shut down, some of them don't. The last time this happened was the .com era, so mid-1990s, right? When the internet business started taking off. And this was another area where it was hard to find prior art because there's not a lot about selling pet food online in the peer-reviewed literature. And so people shotgun patents. So I'm going to sell pet food online. I'm going to sell this online. I'm going to sell that online. And I'm going to file a patent on the idea of doing that. And a lot of them got shot down, but some of them got granted. And then if there's a business around that, they'll sue that party. And there's actually a concept called patent trolls, sort of the classical idea of the troll hiding under the bridge. And then when you go to cross the bridge, the troll jumps out and attacks you. So these patent trolls build these patents. They didn't do any research themselves. They're not making and selling any products themselves. They're just there to wait for someone to cross the bridge and jump out and sue them. And then the worst of these patent trolls, what they'd do is they'd say, it's going to cost you $3, $4, $5 million to knock this patent out in court. Why don't you just give us $500,000 and we'll make this issue go away? And oftentimes they got the money. So that's sort of that game in the worst form. And it does get played every time there's a space for a land grab.
All right, any other questions?
I'm happy to keep asking if no one else has.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just, you shared about the challenge to Compass right now. I'm wondering if you could just say more about what has been granted to them, and what's the challenge. I was also in my prior question just asking about their use, like whether the use part of their patent is concerning to the field, as far as blocking use for depression.
So the granted patents to date, and there's been a handful of them, all relate to the polymorph. They have these pending applications, the ones that we're challenging. that have that broad claim, and it's very broad, right? A method of treating depression with psilocybin. So if that were granted in that form, it would inhibit the industry, and it's not new. Johns Hopkins was doing that before them, and that's actually well documented, even in the peer-reviewed literature. So now that we've provided that information to the Patent Office, hopefully the Patent Office will not grant that claim and force them back to something narrower. As part of that, we've also told the patent examiner about the polymorph A story and raised the issues around whether that's legitimate or not. So, maybe nothing comes out of that process. Time will tell. It's a slow process in the Patent Office. I think it might take a year or two for us to see how that works out with those patent applications, the really broad method ones. But we're putting our knowledge into that stream. So hopefully a just situation comes out of it.
Yeah, thanks. There was like one nuance that I was aware of was they were going after this distinction, I think, of like treatment refractory depression versus depression, and it's like
both of those are in the prior art.
Thank you.
Colleen?
Yes, I had another question. I'm wondering, is there a patent, or are there patents for sorry, I guess I'm getting confused by all the options here about uses and like combination substances, whether or not like you can have just a combination or if it has to be associated with the use. And in that light, what I'm thinking about is is there a patent for the combination of the plants in ayahuasca or yahe, like which vary according to the tribe, and I think that has been tried to do, and I remember hearing that like Taita Kerubin of the Kofans came to try to prevent that, but I heard that failed. So I'm just curious about that. And also, like, is it possible for, like, if those things don't exist, is it possible for like organizations to apply for patents without like particular names on them, but like on behalf of tribes or things like that? This is a big question, but
yeah. So types of things that can be patented. You can patent drug combinations as compositions of matter if that's new. If, like, say, two drugs have never been physically associated with each other before, you can own that independent of the use. You can also patent individual drugs or combinations that are known for new uses if you can show that the new use is novel or non-obvious. So you can kind of the mix and match. Just about everything's fair game to cover in a patent as long as it's new, not obvious, and you meet some of the other criteria. You have to have enough data, or it needs to be someone skilled in the field needs to be able to practice the invention based on what you said in your application with or without data. But in technologically challenging areas, sometimes you need data. Can people file on behalf of Indigenous groups? So one of the requirements of a patent is it has to be novel. So if something's been used, say, for the last 100 years, last 1,000 years, no one can get that, including the groups that innovated it. Anyone who invents something new, whether it's an Indigenous group or a research laboratory scientist, yes, people can file applications on behalf of essentially any inventor, but it does have to be new and non-obvious at the time that application's filed. So sort of all historic knowledge is off the table for everyone. No one's going to be able to get a patent on that unless the patent comes through the process by mistake.
So you can't like get a patent as a protective patent.
Well, it's interesting.
Something that already exists.
There is a concept that it's a term called defensive patents. And really what it is it's a filing made with the Patent Office with the goal of telling the Patent Office about prior art or making that concept prior art. So it's a patent where people don't really care to get the patent granted themselves, but they make this big, broad disclosure to the Patent Office in the form of a patent application. And maybe it even describes older stuff. But by getting it into the patent application, it's much easier for the patent examiners to find it as prior art because it's in their own database, which they will always search their own internal databases. So that is a tactic people will use, is you'll file a patent application loaded up with information about the prior art. Or if you want to dedicate a technology to the public domain, put it in a patent application, file it, never to let it get granted, but now it's in the queue and that blocks anyone else from patenting that and basically keeps it open and free for everyone.
Now, I see one question in the chat. I'm not sure if Amanda just answered it or not.
No, I was just tagging on to the kind of nested nature of some of these claims for different aspects of what they cover.
I see the question. Copyright cannot block these technologies. So copyright law is limited to the categories of ideas that fall into the bucket of sort of artistic expression. Books, movies, music. There's nothing on the copyright side that would be restrictive here, although I will say maybe in a very narrow sense. So software, you can get copyrights on. So to the extent software was a component of some future therapy, which you can imagine maybe some AI thing is involved in future therapies, maybe there's some copyright that runs its course there, but the copyrights on software tend to be extremely narrow and easy to avoid. So copyright's generally not a problem in terms of worrying about someone dominating the space.
But current, I think treatments rely on a set of like aesthetic things almost, like a comfortable room or like a playlist, or even perhaps like some of the things that therapists are encouraged to say or whatnot. Can that constitute a performance?
Well, that's actually interesting. So that's a good question on the copyright side. Now, ultimately, right, so I don't think anyone's proven that, like, say, a particular song is the best song. There's sort of like styles of music that are beneficial. If it turns out that, and maybe some data at some point will show that, a particular Beethoven symphony just works better for whatever reason than something else. Now that's public domain because it's so old and not under copyright. Well, let's say a Metallica song, and I picked them kind of out of humor because that almost certainly won't be the music, but also because they've been really aggressive about protecting their copyright rights. Let's say for whatever reason, Enter Sandman becomes the song that just works best. That would be a problem. That would be a commercial use of that song. Depending on the setting, the hospital, they may actually have a license to play it. Big organizations like restaurants and places that play music actually have a license to play anything that's part of the big copyright music catalogs. There's these organizations like ASCAP and BMI that sort of house all of these songs and make them widely available if you pay these license fees. If the hospital actually had a license fee, they might be able to play that song. If they didn't, they would then either have to avoid Enter Sandman and go back to Beethoven, or go pay for the rights to play Enter Sandman. But in general, I think copyright probably won't get in the way because someone will be able to find some music that works really, really well that either isn't under copyright or where the owners of the song are willing to donate it to these uses or make it available really inexpensively.
I think to the extent that maybe you were thinking about the actual, scene of treatment where there's the room has an appearance and certain actions are taken by the therapist. Copyright only attaches to something like that if it's essentially recorded or reduced to some tangible form, and it only covers the artistic parts of that. So, someone else could, if you recorded that and said you have copyright on that, that doesn't really prevent someone from the therapy. It would just prevent someone from the artistic aspects of whatever performance would be in that.
And to date, I've not seen anyone pressing the copyright side to restrict people in this space. But again, maybe it'll turn out that certain shapes and forms and color patterns end up being best. And in theory, if there's an artistic aspect to that, someone might be able to get a copyright on that. But I haven't seen anyone make a push on that yet.
I'm curious to know a little bit about, could you explain a little bit about the workings of the PTO, the USPTO, and like what's going on there and how many people are responsible for these reviews? And it's just like one person off in an office somewhere. Because I had my friend's dad did this for a while, and he was sort of patent reviewing, and I didn't know how many people were like checking up on his work or if he was just making the decisions. So
yeah, it's so it's a giant organization. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of patent reviewers. They're hired with technical backgrounds so that the patent office staffs itself with people with the right technical expertise to review each type of invention they get. And only with rare exceptions where like some new innovation comes along that just is a new technology, they'll always have someone with reasonably good expertise. It usually just goes to one person to do the review. If it's a junior person, their work will be supervised by a supervisor. But at a certain point, they'll be at a level of expertise where they get to just make the decisions on their own. If they deem something patentable, the patent owner can then they're done. If they deem it unpatentable, the patent owner can challenge it into an appeal process where additional people will look at it. But in this case, we're always worried about the thing being granted. So in that case, oftentimes it'll just be one reviewer looking at it. In general, the patent examiners are well trained. They do a very good job, but they're human beings with all of the fallibilities that human beings have. Some are going to be better than others. Some have good days and bad days. And then layer onto that the harder to access prior art historically here, and you create a recipe for more errors to be made than you'd normally see. But it's a very well-trained professional staff there. I will note they're given insufficient time to do a thorough job. To run the entire process of reading the application, searching the prior art, having all the back and forth communications with the patent applicant, which there's oftentimes multiple rounds of that. Depending on their level of experience, they get somewhere roughly on the order of 12 to 20 hours to complete that whole process, which is not enough to do a fully thorough job ever.
And I was just going to say too, Dave, isn't it the case that like the sort of history of patenting in the US has been a history of like this balance between wanting to stimulate innovation through granting these monopolies and then the need to somehow regulate that, and always with this problem of like how much labor can we put into that process of prosecuting a patent, right? And so from what I understand, various changes in the system of patenting have arisen in response to problems that people just kind of started patenting other people's inventions, and that's why there was a prosecution process that sort of came up, and likewise the third party submission process is in response to the sort of internet boom of patents. So that's a fairly new thing. I forget what year, but this is a new process that the USPTO has created for third parties to get involved and kind of do this activist work. And in some of my scholarship, I kind of frame what we're doing in Porta Sophia as something that anybody in any kind of field with any sort of expertise, right, can kind of replicate our workflow to intervene and kind of be a patent activist, if you will, through those third-party submissions. So.
All right, anyone else with any questions?
I have one more question. Just what is the basic cost for like an individual filing a patent?
Yeah, it's a good
without
question.
Without a lawyer, even if it like just like from the most, I'm sure that when you get lawyers involved and the more complex it gets, the more expensive it gets. But like, if someone just has an idea, how much does that cost?
Yeah, let me give you the lawyer answer first because that's the most common one. $10,000 to $50,000 per patent application would be pretty typical.
Yeah.
They can be less, but rarely they can be more, not as rarely. If you do it completely yourself and you're an individual, because the government charges different fees depending on how big your organization is. They essentially give discounts if you're a small entity and even further discounts if you're an individual. Other than your time and the value of your time, which personal time has value, but ignoring that, you can get through the process of getting the patent granted for roughly around $1,000. There are some costs to maintain it over time. 3.5 years, 7.5 years, and 11.5 years after it's granted, you have to pay maintenance fees to keep it around. Those escalate in cost over time, also discounted for smaller entities, but you could get about $1,000. So like if you wanted to try 50 of these. It's still, even doing it yourself, a huge time commitment, but then even a big cost commitment.
Thanks.
And that's just the US. Internationally, much, much, much more expensive.
Yeah, when you say internationally, are patents applied for, like companies in the US would apply for an international patent and that would apply across like the entire world, or just sort of a subset of countries that have bought into this larger system?
Yeah, there's your latter discussion there is exactly characterizing it correctly. There's a group of countries, most of the major market countries in the world, Taiwan's one of the rare exceptions that's not part of this, have joined something called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, or PCT. And essentially what that does is, in the old days, if you wanted a patent application everywhere, the day you filed it, you'd have to file it in each of the countries, which was super challenging. Under this PCT treaty, essentially, the countries agreed to honor each other's initial filings. So you could start with a filing, say, in the United States, if you were a US inventor. And then you have up to a year after that to file the international holding place version of that called the PCT application. And once you file that, you get another year and a half to then decide which countries you want to put that in. So you get to defer the costs for about 2.5 years after your initial filing. But at some point, you do have to enter it into and choose each of the foreign countries, pay the fees to go into those countries. And then the review process is actually done at the country basis. So if you get it granted in the United States, that has essentially no impact on anywhere else in the world. Every other country is going to do their own review. And I'll just note there are some conglomerations, like there is a European Patent Office that does a review for many, but not all of the European countries. And then their decision sort of is binding on each of the individual countries. There's a few other ones like that, but in general, you have to go through the process in each individual country.
Yeah, that's a good point that maybe isn't realized, that if you obtain a United States patent, that gives you rights in the United States, right? So if you have protection here, someone could do the exact same thing in the UK and not be infringing. So if you want to stop that there, you've got to get a patent there. So the rights are, the constructs the government gives you, and they're limited to the jurisdictions where they're issued. So if you want worldwide coverage, you've got to file worldwide.
And the cost of that, like if you filed in all of the PCT countries, your upfront cost at the time you're sort of doing that filing would trip over $1 million just to start the process off.
All right, anyone else want to the chat? I don't see any other ones. Well, we're about at time, so I think we can call it here. And I don't know if David or anyone else has any parting words that they want to say.
Yeah, just a big thank you from all of us on the Porta Sophia side for taking an interest in this topic. The more people that know more about this, the better the system's going to work. So, thank you for letting us do this, and I hope we didn't bore you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for being here. That was very interesting. I'll unmute everyone so they can give their thank yous. But it was fascinating. I really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Spread
It's
the
really
word.
hard work.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice.